So, I will start off with a little introduction about me. I'm also from FHIR, where I work as a FHIR consultant. And one of my assignments is METMij, which is a Dutch national program where we want to enable every citizen to have access to his or her healthcare data inside a personal health environment. And the whole communication between all those healthcare providers and the patient is based on FHIR. So within that program, I'm involved in creating profiles, creating test scripts, and also work on our implementation guide. Beside METMij, I also work a lot on our FHIR tools, or you can think of support or writing all the marketing mails you may have received. So, we're here for the FHIR for Specifies track. As you may know, FHIR is an international standard which can be tailored for a specific use case. Well, this is also called profiling. And these 4 or 5 tracks in this, or these 5 tutorials in this track are all here to teach you how to do this. And just before this presentation, Michel Rutte gave you an introduction about FHIR profiling. So I'm wondering who of you was at the former presentation? Not so much. That's good. Well, after this tutorial, Ewout will talk to you about FHIR path, which is it's much like XPath, but then specific for FHIR. And this is very useful when you're actually creating your profiles. Tomorrow, Martin Smith will go through the Profiling Academy, which is an online learning platform we created where we posted all our best practices and exercises about profiling. So it's a great documentation to check by. Then we're here now at the Implementation Guide Authoring, where we will go into depth more on the functional parts of creating an implementation guide. And tomorrow we will follow up with a tutorial about the tools that are available that can help you create implementation guide tooling. And then we're talking about Simplifier, about the IG publishing tool, and Trifolia. So for now, this tutorial is split into 3 sections. First, we will talk about the concept of an implementation guide, so what it is, why it's important, what kinds of implementation guides are out there. Then we have a short part where we go into the general content that should go into an IG. And lastly, I will demonstrate the commonly known structure for implementation guides, and we will go through a couple of those sections where I will show you examples in implementation guides that are already publicly published. So for now, the implementation guide concept. To get a bit of feeling of the audience, I'm very curious, who of you in the room has already created an implementation guide? So by hands? Or a couple. So who of you are planning to create an implementation guide? No, that's more. So yeah, keep in mind those who already created one, because maybe afterwards you can just connect and try to exchange some knowledge. Well, an implementation guide. FHIR will most likely never be implemented as a whole, and as is. So you will likely have a selection of resources that you will need for your use case, and also you will mostly not need all the search parameters, or you will not need every API functionality. So your implementation guide is actually the wrapper around all the resources and all the stuff you want to include. And you bind it together and you bring it as a human readable form and in some understandable way to the implementers. So here's actually the definition that is part of the implementation guide resource on FHIR. So why do you want to create an implementation guide? It seems like a lot of work to create all the text and documentation, it always is. But you can imagine if you created all your profiles and all your conformance resources and just handing them all over as a package to an implementer, they will most likely not know what to do with it or how to implement it. So it's a good way to document how those things are used. And having all that information packed together with a lot of guidance will most likely help in getting your solution implemented faster, and also in a more standardized way, because instead of providing manual implementation support to your implementers, you will now have everything documented at one place as a single source of truth. So those implementation can be more the same. And lastly, it also enables you to scale your implementation adoption. So I've got a good example in the Netherlands where a healthcare provider or a vendor called Zorgtermijn is in the middle of connecting healthcare providers based on e-referrals of patients. And now they entered a new domain where they wanted to connect general practitioners to physiotherapists. And they chose, instead of HL7 version 2, they chose FHIR because now they wanted to try something out and they wanted to get their connection implemented faster. So they created a very nice implementation guide, and they noticed that a lot of the vendors already worked on the connection, and they were building it on their own. And eventually they knocked on the door of Zorgtermijn saying they were ready without even notifying Zorgtermijn that they were actually building it. So yeah, that's an example of if you create a good implementation guide, you can decrease the amount of work you have in actually providing implementation support. So these are a couple of the reasons why you want to create an implementation guide. And if we have a look on what goes in, which resources will most likely go into an implementation guide, you now here see the resource page of the FHIR specification, and I think most likely the structure definition will go in. They're also known as the profiles. And with the structure definition, you say how other resources should look like. So I think this is definitely the backbone of your implementation guide. And also, you will include other conformance resources. So if you define additional search parameters or operation definitions needed for your implementation, you will include them. But also a capability statements. Like in FHIR, servers are, they need to pose a capability statement where they state their capabilities. But you can also create a capability statement resource where you say the required information, the required capabilities of a server or client. So they will know in a structured way how a system should look like. Next to the conformance resources, you will put in all your additional terminology resources, which will most likely be these 4, when they are defined for or needed for the implementation at hand. So to clarify, we're not talking about the FHIR resource implementation guide. That's a guide that is more of a technical kind, which is used by a couple of tools, and you can describe in a structured way how things are related, but that's not where we are talking about. Tomorrow we will go a little bit into depth in this resource as part of the tutorial about implementation guide tooling, but for now we're talking about the human readable form of an implementation guide. And if we look out there, look out at the publicly available guides, I think we can define 2 types. You got the old-fashioned PDFs and large documents, and the nowadays more available web pages. And if you have to choose between either of these forms, I will definitely recommend to go for the web pages instead of handing over a very big document or documents. So if we look at implementation guides a bit more, I think we can categorize them in having different scopes. And if we look at that categorization based on the amount and information or the scale of information, I think we can define these 4 scopes, which are strategy, guiding principles, subject, and use cases. And I will go through them one by one and provide some examples of IGs out there. So at first you have the strategy-based implementation guides, which are most likely national-based IGs, very big. They they give overview, and they have made most of the time strategic choices. So for example, we have the NetMij implementation guide, which has a very big center guide with a lot of information about architecture, about security, about privacy, and it is referencing to more specific guides for implementing certain use cases. And next to it, we also have the Care Connect API from Interopen, which is also a very big implementation guide for the UK, where they give guidance on how to use the national defined resources for the United Kingdom in healthcare. Well, the following scope is the guiding principles, and here you can think of the US Core implementation guide or the Basis DA. And these guides are most likely made having overarching principles, and they're designed to be implemented by other FHIR implementation guides. So they create the specific, still very open profiles, for example, for the United States. And the intent is that they're being used by other more specific implementation guides. So not everyone has to reinvent the wheel again for all those profiles. Then the following scope is subject, which are implementation guides based on a subject, and most of the time they have multiple use cases. The two examples are the Ardon scheduling implementation guides, where there are a couple of use cases concerning how to book an appointment for a patient or a provider, or the implementation guide about medication in the United States. And lastly, we have the implementation guide that really cover one or two use cases, and they describe all the interactions and data structures. And the example is the Zorgdomein implementation guide, where I just talked about a couple of minutes ago. So for a small recap, we looked at implementation guides, which are actually a kind of a wrapper on specified conformance and terminology resources. We talked about it is the human readable form that enables implementers to implement your desired solution. Well, we've seen that I think web pages are definitely more appealing than the PDF, so we stick to that. And we've seen that there are a couple of scopes ranging from nationally based scopes to actually an implementation guide covering a use case. So now we're going to the content on a very general level. And this is of course very depending on the scale and scope of the guide, where we just talked about, but also on the background of the IG producing organization, because you can imagine that, for example, a vendor wants to create a shinier guide than a standardization organization. And of course, with every content you create, it's also very important to keep your intended audience in mind. So we're talking about implementation guide implementers, but who are those implementers, or who is the intended audience? I think it's safe to say that they are developers. In the end, are the developers who will implement the FHIR solutions you will describe in your implementation guide. So keep them in mind. And well, having them in mind, how should an IG, how should the content be fitted to to that audience? Well, for starters, I think it's very important to think of language. Well, here in the United States, maybe that's not really the case, but for the Netherlands, we decided to write our implementation guide in English because a lot of developers in the Netherlands are not native Dutch and they cannot speak Dutch, while every Dutch developer knows English, so it's obvious to then choose to write it in English. I think it's also very safe to say that you want to include as much examples as possible, because, well, an example will definitely clarify a lot at hand, and I think developers would like to firstly see what is to be done instead of reading a lot of text. Another thing is also to provide as much as testing tools or validation tools out there, so a developer can work on its own and go through your implementation guide and see if it's in the right track before really reaching out and say like, I'm stuck. And this will also decrease your actual implementation support for it. So on a very general level, I think you would want to keep your introductions and all your necessary text as short as possible. So provide a short and clear overview with as little textual overhead as possible, but the trick is to allow for quick access to details if needed. And those web pages definitely are an improvement to that compared to the documents, because now if you see a profile, you can just click on and see the details if needed. Some tips for creating the content. I think it's always good to use an additional proofreader. here are two suggestions for tools. You got the Hemingway editor or Grammarly, which proofread everything you read. Right. If you create web pages, you will definitely create a lot of links, and in the end, links get broken. So I think it's very good to use a link checker. There are a lot of them out there, and just when you're publishing or when your IG is live, use a link checker to see if there are dead links and adjust them. And a very simple tip, but very effective, is always try to refer to a specific version of the FHIR specification, because the FHIR specification is still under development, and if you refer to the without the version in it, when a new version is released, all your links are not valid anymore because they now refer to the new version. So this was it for the content, where the recap is to know your audience, which will most likely be developers. Try to keep your IG to the point, but still have access to detail if needed. And there are used tools and like proofreaders to improve the quality of your work. So we will continue with the structure of an IG, where we go have a look at the commonly included sections. If we look at those sections, I think these are the commonly included sections. And I will go through them one by one and provide a couple of examples. So for starters, your implementation guide will have a home page or an introduction field where you will actually give some metadata on your implementation guide. And I think it's very important to have a version of your implementation guide and also mention the version on the FHIR specification on which the implementation guide is based. Here in this homepage, you can give already on a very high level the actors that are involved and which use cases it covers. And well, you can mention your scope, purpose, and a lot of other things. On the right side, you see two example first pages, which are probably not very readable, but I think this section is pretty straightforward. So we continue to the use case section. This is where you will functionally describe the use cases your implementation guide covers. So here you will give an overview of the systems and architecture that are in place, and you will describe the actors in more detail. So you will give all the scenarios out there and how those actors are triggered within those scenarios. So this is also the place where you can make all your diagrams and include your diagrams, because otherwise you will get a lot of text. And perhaps you would also need to dive into your old UML books again. Further here in the functional description, you can also already refer to the data sets or data elements that are included, and you would describe with text the business rules that apply. So for example, a system must have a consent on file for before data can be exchanged for a patient. So you will describe this. I will demonstrate this for the Ontario Provincial Provider Registry to show how they did this. I will click on it any sec. So here we have the implementation guide of the Provincial Provider Registry, and here you have their homepage, and then in the section business context they provide their use cases, and also here you've seen the actors, they're listed down, and they also provided their business rules, which I just mentioned. So you would definitely want to have a functional overview of the use cases at hand. So let's continue. Next section is where it gets fiery again, because here you will provide the technical implementation guidance, and you will do this per use case or transaction, where you have a very small introduction on the use case or transaction, and you will mention which actors are involved. you would also likely to say on a functional level what is expected of the senders and receiver. So for example, upon a post of a new resource, the sender shall return a body with a newly stored resource. And then you would list all the invocations that are out there. So how does the request or response should look like? Is it a read? Is it a search? Is it a put? These are all the interactions. And if you have extra, or if you use operations or search parameters, you will also list them here. Together with all the conformance resources, how the response or request should look like. And on the right side, you see an example of the implementation guide I just showed you from the Provincial Provider Registry, where they describe how a practitioner search request is being handled within their implementation. So you have a get with the use of an identifier search parameter, and below they reference to how the response and search should look like. This is also the place where you want to add as much examples as possible. So make an example of the search URL you're using, or how the request message looks like. And this is also applicable for the response message. And it's always good to have examples of your profiles, so your resource instances, and you can refer to them as well. And I think the Argonaut scheduling implementation guide does this very well. So I'll show that implementation guide. So here we have the Argo scheduling implementation guide, and if we go to a use case, for example, the patient-based scheduling, you will see a couple of use cases listed here. So if we choose for the one, where a patient wants to look for appointments, you will first have a couple of scenarios with actors and a little functional overview, where the first step is a patient login. We will skip that. And the second part is that you will search for appointment availability. And below here you will see exactly how that's done. So you see you can use a get or a post with an operation find. And above here is how the response should look like. And the very nice thing here is the example button. So when you press the example, you will instantly see how those messages should look like. And I think this is really helpful for implementers, because you can see instantly what's going on. So we're going back. So the following section that will be included are the profiles and extension sections. And most likely from your, as we've seen, from your technical guidance section, you will refer to the profiles that are included in those transactional use cases. In your guide, you will most likely have, for every profile and for every extension, will have its own page, which would look much like the resource pages of the FHIR specification itself. So you will again introduce the introduction and scope of that profile, how it's used, where it's used. You will give your profile an official URL or its canonical URL where the profile is identified with. This is also the place where you can say which elements are considered as must support, and then you should also explain what must support actually means for your implementation. And of course, your profile or extension page will also have the rendered structured the rendered form of your data structure, which is on the right side. You see screen an example of such a rendering. And this section should also allow an implementer to download the XML or JSON or Turtle, and you should include links to examples of this profile. And it's very wise to auto-generate a lot of this, of course, based on your profiles. Because your profiles consist of a lot of data, and I think this page can be built from a lot of data which are already inside your profile. So another example on how this is done in the Argonaut data query implementation guide. So here we have the guide, and on the top you see the profiles and extensions sections. And when you click there, you see all the profiles that belong to this implementation guide. And if we click, for example, on the allergy intolerance profile, you have a page which contains a lot of the sections I just described. Within the middle, the differential table and the snapshot table. Is it clear for everyone what the difference is between a differential and a snapshot? Yeah, just wondering. Okay, so this is how a profile page normally looks like. So on the top you can see the XML version, JSON, or the mappings that are included. So the following section is the terminology section, where you will put in also on all your value set code system, naming system, and concept maps, and I think every value set will have its own page. And instead of the profiles that will most likely be referenced from the technical guidance page, you will reference to those value set pages from your profiles, so not from within the technical guidance. And that mostly goes when you bind, for example, a value set to an element, you have a binding, and from there, shown in the red box, you can click to a value set, which is this man. Like I already mentioned in the beginning, something about the capability statement. You can also create a capability statement to show how a desired solution should look like. You do this by editing the kind element and set it to requirements. And I think it's very common in all the implementation guides out there to include such a capability statement per actor. So on the right side you have the Dove Research implementation guide, which lists capability statements for every actor. Well, we're talking about patient data exchange, and I think security is definitely a thing you should take into account. You can also, it's common to, you can reference to the certain security sections that are available in the FHIR spec that are applicable for you, but you can also refer to other more specific guides for it. For example, if you use Smart on FHIR, you would likely to also refer to the Smart on FHIR specifications. Well, the last section is the general help and support section, where you should not forget to include your contact details and how to receive feedback. It's also good to include frequently asked questions if applicable. It may help decrease your implementation burden. And this is also the place where you would list all the tools that implementers could use to help them in implementing the solution faster. And of course, a section where you can download all the artifacts in your implementation guide. So, if we do a little recap, we talked about the home page where you have your metadata about your implementation guide. You would include a functional description on your use cases. You will provide a more FHIR technical guidance on how exactly you want to exchange which data. And from there, you will likely reference to all the profiles and extensions that are in place, which in turn will likely reference to all the terminology pages in your IG. It's wise to include a capability statement to say how a server or client should look like. Of course, we've got security, very important. And lastly, the general help and support, where you can provide a list of tools out there. So, if you're going to start to write your own implementation guide, I think it's very wise to first have a look at the implementation guides out there. Or have a look at the templates available. So the first two links are links to templates of an implementation guide that you can use. And below you have the FHIR.org/guide/registry where a list of implementation guides is available. And below you can also look on Simplifier for publicly published implementation guides. And I think the slides will be available after. So I'm seeing people make this. So this was it for this tutorial. We've got 3 tutorials coming up on the FHIR for specifiers track. So after lunch, Ewa will continue with FHIR path. Tomorrow we have the Profiling Academy, and tomorrow we will go into depth about the 3 different tools available to our knowledge that can help you create implementation guides. And I created some exercises for this as well, which I will mention in this tutorial. So for this, this was the tutorial about offering implementation guides. Are there any questions? Yeah.
So for the implementation guide, can't we use the API documentation tools like Swagger and all?
What's the question? Sorry, the question again. So
you know the online API documentation tools like Swagger and all?
Yeah, I know. I haven't worked with it, but I know it's out there. So the question is how to use.
Yeah, can we use that? Is that something recommended?
I'm
Swagger
not.
is more like you can go and see all the APIs and methods listed. You can potentially fly it out, or you can post and you can try it out how it works.
I think so. I haven't have too much experience with that, so I don't.
So
I'm not.
previous, in the first lecture, the introduction to FHIR, somebody asked that question, and they said that the data types are too specific to use something like Swagger, so you can't typically use Swagger to outline the implementation.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So if your implementation is if you're only going to be accepting data, you're not going to let people query, and you're only accepting XML, do you only then document those?
Well, that's something you definitely want to state in your implementation guide. That, for example, you only use XML. So yeah, that's a choice you can make, and then you should maybe also provide the reason why or whatever in your implementation guide. But does that answer your question? Because yeah.
So you're not obligated to fill it in. If you actually don't do those things, you don't document it.
You're not obliged to. Sorry to.
You don't have to. There's no rules about what you. So there's nothing in FHIR that says you have to provide all the different ways of getting at these resources.
No.
You just have to do what you're going to do.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, a thing what a server or servers must is have a capability statement that says what it is capable of, and I think at least you should be able to do XML, JSON, or XML or JSON or Turtle. Yeah.
There's a reason why it's because JSON is not an acceptable language. It's in the context of another standard that's not acceptable.
Okay. Yeah, please.
In your experience from an organizational profile layer, implementation guide layer, how have organizations put together their own internal registry? They use specifically like SharePoint, or what do they use for their own internal registry?
Well, do you know of the registry Simplifier? Because I work at a couple of companies, and then we use Simplifier as our repository for our FHIR work.
Is there security on there that you can just say then that these are only visible within a firewall?
Well, within Simplifier, it's only the making private project is only within the paid accounts, but it's possible. But I think GitHub, for example, or any Git repository is used as well for this purpose, where you can just list. In the end, there's just XML or JSON files.
I just was curious.
Yeah. Erik.
I would just add that the Swagger stuff, each also already publishes create Swagger files. So it's still work in progress. I'm trying to get the Swagger files into static, not that it's just not true. I think in the future you might see more using the dynamic, things like Swagger collections. So it's not a question.
Fine. So. Any other questions? Or I think otherwise it's time for an early lunch, right? Please.